You walk into a museum today and see them. Behind glass, archive rod, iron chains, execution poles, tools from 1944 that once broke bones in basement cells across Europe. The plaques explain what they did. The walls still carry scratches from prisoners who knew they were going to die. You see them and you wonder, where did they come from? Who kept them? Who decided these things were worth saving? May 1945. Berlin is rubble. The Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse took Allied bombs through 1944 and 1945. The SS security main office next door is gutted. Same for the Sicherheitsdienst building. 3 structures that coordinated deportations, ran interrogation chambers, and ordered executions across an entire continent. All 3 reduced to broken concrete and twisted steel. American forces roll through. Soviet troops come from the east. They film what they find. Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau. Cameras capture the gallows, the posts, the chambers. April 12, 1945, Dwight Eisenhower tours Ohrdruf with Omar Bradley and George Patton. Survivors demonstrate how the torture worked, using life-size dolls, reenacting the positions, showing where the chains attached. This footage goes to Nuremberg. This becomes evidence. If you value documented history and factual research like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Collections Archive, particularly film records cataloged under National Archives, identifiers 111M1190, captured between April and September 1945, and the Arelson Archives documentation of Nuremberg evidence portfolios marked Set Number 5, containing 28 photographs of SS torture methods. Now back to the information. The thing is, nobody made a plan. No Allied command issued an order saying preserve the instruments. Document the devices, catalog the tools. The focus was survival, food, medicine, displaced persons camps overflowing with skeletal survivors who needed calories not cataloging, 15,000 at Buchenwald, 60,000 at Bergen-Belsen, with over 13,000 already dead and unburied when British forces arrived. Fort Breendonk in Belgium. British troops liberate it. September 4, 1944. Charles Arnold Baker, MI6 officer, takes command. The fort is intact. Torture chamber in the basement, archive rod still mounted. The device they hung prisoners from with arms behind their backs. Execution poles in the courtyard. Gallows. Between 3,500 and 3,600 prisoners passed through this fort. 1,733 died before liberation. 300 died inside the fort itself. The rest sent to camps in Germany and Poland. Arnold Baker doesn't destroy it. The Belgian government doesn't demolish it. October 17, 1944. Belgian Minister of Justice orders the fort evacuated but not razed. They use it to hold collaborators, Flemish SS guards, Belgian traitors. Then August 19, 1947, Belgian Parliament declares it a national memorial. The torture chamber remains. The archive rod stays bolted to the wall. The execution poles stand where prisoners were shot. One of Europe's first preserved Nazi sites. Open to the public while war crimes trials are still running. Kristiansand, Norway. Archivet building. Gestapo headquarters for southern Norway from 1942 to 1945. 311 Norwegians tortured here. Oldest was 67. Youngest was 16. 4 were women. Henrietta B. Lorentzen was pregnant when they arrested her. Pole Eichen was the only one to die directly from torture at Archivet. Approximately 50 Soviet prisoners were executed by the Gestapo here. The Norwegians kept the building, kept the cells. The inscriptions prisoners scratched into walls are still there. The authentic tools used for torture are displayed. The building becomes a museum. The basement restored to its 1942 to 1945 condition. You can visit today, close the cell door behind you, use the flashlight provided, read the scratches. Here are recordings of prisoner testimony from hidden speakers. The place is called the House of Horror. It stands in downtown Kristiansand, Bergen, Norway, another Gestapo headquarters. This one becomes a museum showing authentic tools. The cells with inscriptions covering every surface from floor to ceiling. Written by tortured prisoners during the war. Written again after liberation by Norwegian traitors and German war criminals locked in the same cells. The museum opens with interactive screens letting you follow prisoner itineraries from Bergen through camps in Germany and back, comparing prisoner testimony with torture explanations. The museum is suitable for ages 13 and up, Warsaw, Poland. The Ministry of Religious Beliefs and Public Education building. Nazis convert it to Sicherheitspolizei and Sicherheitsdienst headquarters. The whole street closes to Poles. Basement becomes rough jails. Prisoners are tortured, beaten. Pregnant women are not exempt. Polish prisoners scratched sentences into the prison walls. Personal messages, patriotic statements, religious inscriptions. The building survives. Today it houses Poland's Ministry of National Education. The basement is the Mausoleum of Struggle and Martyrdom. Branch of the Museum of Independence. The walls with the scratched inscriptions are preserved. The torture chamber is reconstructed. Dim lighting, sound effects of screaming. A replica of the Gestapo chief's office. Uniform on display. Documents on the desk. Tools used for torture. It opened as a museum preserving what happened in those rooms. But these are exceptions. Most sites were not preserved. Most equipment was not saved. Paris, France, Gestapo torture chamber discovered after liberation. March of Time cameramen film it. The chamber where victims were burned. Handprints visible on walls. A survivor places his hands in the impressions to show the camera. Wooden posts where people were tied. Bullet holes at the top. Rosary beads and a blindfold placed on one post. Film dated 1945. The chamber is inspected. Then what? No museum opens there. The building returns to civilian use. The evidence is filmed and then gone. Athens, Greece, 6 Merlin Street, Gestapo requisitions. The building, primary interrogation center, torture chambers, prison cells. Hundreds passed through, many tortured to death. Others sent to Chaidery concentration camp. Bodies hung from trees for days, guarded by local collaborators. Message received. October 1944, Germans withdraw. The building returns to civilian use. 1980s, it converts to a shopping center. Today, it houses a beauty retail chain. Where the torture chambers were is now retail space. A small memorial marks the spot. That's all. Berlin, Prince Albrecht Strasse, the Gestapo headquarters, the SS Reich security main office. These buildings are destroyed by bombs. Early 1945. What's left, standing the Allies find in rubble. The boundary between American and Soviet occupation zones runs right along this street. It becomes a fortified boundary. 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up, runs along the south side of the street, now renamed Niederkirchenstrasse. After the war, the ruins are demolished. 1950s. The area becomes a bumper car site, a dumping ground for rubble from Kreuzberg renovations. The location of the most feared headquarters in Europe becomes a playground and a trash heap. 1978. Berlin architecture critic Dieter Hoffmann Axthelm writes essays, surveys, notes the historical significance, says this site matters. Nobody listened for years. 1987, Berlin's 750th anniversary, first exhibition on site history. Research continues, leads to documentation center, collecting evidence. 1992, 2 years after reunification, a foundation is created. 1993, architectural competition for permanent museum. Peter Zumthor's design wins. Construction starts, then stops. Funding problems. The concrete core stands unfinished for years. The cellar of the Gestapo headquarters is excavated, where political prisoners were tortured, where executions happened. These basement cells are found, uncovered, turned into memorial, open air, protected by canopy. Excavation happens with East German researchers. Joint exhibition shown at the site and in East Germany. 1989, 2010, new documentation center opens. Topography of Terror, 4 exhibition areas, permanent exhibition about Gestapo, SS, and Reich Security main office. Exhibition trench along excavated basement walls, 15 tour stops around the site, the remains of late 19th century buildings, colonnade of former Prince Albrecht Palais, cellars of former SS canteen, vestiges of prison yard wall, floor monument protected by sand and gravel covering the prison foundations, 200 meters of Berlin Wall preserved along Niederkirchnerstrasse, no torture devices on display, no archive rods, no chains. Those were lost, destroyed, thrown away. Buried in rubble when the buildings came down. What remains are foundations, photographs, documents, the structure itself telling the story. 2 million visitors per year come to see empty basements and read about what happened. Most Gestapo headquarters across Europe followed the same path. Bombing, demolition, forgetting. Then, decades later, rediscovery, Nuremberg, Germany, Palace of Justice, November 20, 1945, to October, 1 Mars, 1946, International Military Tribunal, 22 defendants, 4 chief prosecutors. The evidence presented is not physical devices. It's film, photographs, documents, testimony, footage of liberated concentration camps. Allied military photographers captured it. Graphic scenes of what took place. Most powerful evidence at trial. Nazi concentration and prison camps film. The Nazi plan film, detailed description of final solution, murders of prisoners of war, atrocities in extermination camps, Buchenwald survivors reenact torture methods for cameras using life-size dolls. 28 photographs and evidence portfolio marked Exhibit B1 shows torture methods, operating room, barracks, liberated prisoners. The portfolio is classified confidential. Few copies circulate in the courtroom. Set number 5 is preserved in Arelson archives. Contains handwritten comments. Testimony describes torture. French documents submitted. Exhibit number RF307. Robert Vanisha from Tourcoing states he was arrested February 22, 1944. Interrogated, locked in wooden coffin for 2 to 3 hours. Could only breathe through 3 holes in top. Belgian documents. Norway documents from Norwegian government dated UK 79. Numerous Norwegian citizens died from cruel treatment during interrogations. German police report states torture used. Beating with rod, rubber bludgeon, more flagrant forms leaving lasting injuries. Order to use torture came from higher authorities. Possibly Goering as chief of Geheime Staatspolizei. At least from Heydrich, the trials last 11 months. 600 prosecution exhibits, 1,400 defense exhibits, testimony of more than 100 witnesses. Doctors, the trial lasts 140 days. 85 witnesses, nearly 1,500 documents, medical experiments on unwilling victims, high-altitude tests, freezing, seawater, malaria, typhus, mustard gas, bone transplantation, epidemic jaundice, sterilization, experiments on pregnant women, twins, incendiary bombs, but physical torture devices, almost none presented. The evidence is survivor testimony, photographs of what was done, documents ordering the actions, affidavits, films, not the actual implements. Why? Because most were makeshift. Gestapo made torture devices themselves at Archivit, used what they had on hand: archive rod, regular rod, beating instruments, whips, handcuffs, blows and kicks, slow psychological torture, standing for hours with hands overhead, nothing specialized. Nothing that screams torture device when sitting in evidence locker. Just ordinary objects used in extraordinary cruelty. Concentration camps had instruments. Auschwitz had flogging devices. The post for Strapato, hanging torture. Block 11 in main camp for confinement. These were structures built into the camp, not portable, not easily moved. When camps were liberated, the priority was survivors, not artifacts, not tools, getting people to hospitals, documenting the dead, counting bodies, recording names. April 23, 1945. Buchenwald. American soldiers find tattooed human skin, piece of man's body, skinned by SS, used as decoration on their quarters wall. This makes it to evidence, preserved, documented. Certificate signed by Lieutenant George C. Demas, U.S. Naval Reserve, associated with U.S. Chief of Counsel for Prosecution of Axis Criminality, delivered by War Crimes Section, found in Buchenwald, captured by military forces under Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Forces. Human head, skull bone removed, shrunken, stuffed, preserved. This too becomes evidence. But these are Nazi trophies, not torture instruments. The instruments themselves, mostly gone. What about the camps that stayed intact? Mauthausen in Austria, liberated May 5, 1945, by U.S. 11th Armored Division. Camp constructed as gigantic stone fortress on mountaintop. Permanent structures, large garrison, designed for long-term use. Unlike many camps, substantial infrastructure survives liberation, becomes memorial, museum, but torture devices, the descriptions survive. The methods documented, the results photographed, the actual implements, lost to history. Dachau, first SS concentration camp, established March 1933, model for administration and organization of all SS concentration camps, liberated April the 29th. 1945, about a dozen guards shot during liberation by American troops. Some resist. About 30 killed according to commanding officer Felix L. Sparks. Later sources claim over 500. The camp becomes site of American military tribunals. November 1945 to December 1947. 199 defendants tried, 161 convicted, 37 sentenced to death. The trials happen at Dachau itself. But again, evidence is testimony. Documents? Film. Not extensive physical artifacts of torture. The pattern repeats. Camps liberated, survivors aided, dead counted, sites filmed, then demolition, reuse, forgetting, or preservation as empty structures. Walls, barracks, gates, not the instruments. Some items do survive. Prague. 1946. Testimony of Walter Lubner. Arrested April 18, 1939 by Prague Gestapo. Imprisoned in Sachsenhausen, Oranienburg, Auschwitz, Dora Elric, describes SS Oberscharführer Brinkmann forcing prisoner accused of cannibalism to eat human body parts. Salt and pepper passed. Prisoner killed same day. Lubner escapes April 21, 1945. His testimony becomes part of documentation campaign, lists names of cruel Gestapo and SS members, describes their torture methods, but physical evidence? Documentation only. Tübingen Anatomy Institute received 1,077 bodies from Stuttgart execution site between 1933 and 1945. After war, 4 slides prepared from 2 corpses of executed Nazi victims found 1 Polish woman, 1 presumed German man. Heidelberg found 3 slides dating to 1941 and 1943, marked decapitatus, indication they may be Nazi persecution victims. These specimens ultimately removed from West German medical schools, buried in State of Israel, given appropriate commemorations. This happens because of effective lobbying. But this is 1980s, 4 decades after the war, and these are slides, tissue samples, not torture instruments. Medieval torture museums exist across Europe, Prague, Bruges, collections of thumbscrews, Iron Maidens, racks, devices from 13th to 18th centuries, Bruges Torture Museum and former medieval prison called the Old Stone. Over 100 devices, displayed chronologically, equipped with mannequins showing how they worked. These survived because collectors preserved them, because museums acquired them over centuries, because they were seen as historically significant artifacts of criminal justice evolution. Nazi torture devices, no such collecting happened. No systematic preservation, no immediate recognition that these needed documentation. Why? Multiple reasons. First, the scale. Tens of thousands of Nazi camps and detention sites, 44,000 documented, each with their own methods, their own improvised instruments. Standardization existed in some places, but much was local, made on site, used and discarded. Second, the priority. Immediate post-war needs were massive. Displaced persons, millions of refugees, war crimes to prosecute, governments to rebuild, economies to restart. Nobody tasked with going building to building collecting torture implements. Third, the disgust. These were instruments of unimaginable cruelty. The natural human response was destruction. Burn it, bury it, forget it existed, make it go away, keep the testimony, keep the photographs, but the actual objects, get them out of sight. Fourth, the politics. Cold War divides Europe. Berlin Wall goes up 1961. Sites on eastern side, inaccessible to Western researchers. Sites on western side often demolished or reused. Documentation happens piecemeal. National projects, not international coordination. Each country dealing with its own history in its own way. Fifth, the silence. Post-war Germany was not ready to confront. The trials happened. Convictions secured. Then, Germans wanted to rebuild. Look forward, not backwards. West Germany granted pardons. Early releases. 1949. Releases of Nuremberg military tribunal convicts begin. 1951. High Commissioner John J. McCloy overturns most sentences. Last 3 prisoners from Einsatzgruppen trial. Released 1958. The pressure to move on, to forget, to not preserve reminders. The result? Most torture devices from Nazi Germany were destroyed, lost, thrown away, or forgotten. What survives exists in a handful of preserved sites. Breendonk with its archive rod, Bergen with its authentic tools, Warsaw with its reconstructed chamber, Christiansand with its basement intact, Athens with only a memorial plaque, Berlin with excavated foundations and no instruments. The evidence that went to Nuremberg was primarily documentary, films, photographs, survivor sketches. JacquesAux, interned at Breendonk 1940 to 1942, escaped. Few drawings survived from his time there, used them after war to reconstruct scenes. Published 1947 in book called Breendonk, Bagnards at Barreau, Slave Laborers and Hangmen. These reconstructions, these testimonies, these became the record, not the physical objects. What this means is understanding Nazi torture relies on survivor accounts, on photographs taken at liberation, on war crimes, investigation reports, on excavated cells with scratched messages, on buildings preserved as memorials, on documentation assembled across decades. The physical instruments themselves, mostly absent from the historical record. The exceptions tell us what was possible. Fort Breendonk preserved because Belgian government acted fast. 1947. Designation as National Memorial, before Cold War hardened, before focus shifted, before the impulse to demolish won out. The torture chamber remains. The tools remain. because someone decided in 1947 that this needed preservation, that future generations needed to see, to understand, to remember. Norway's sites preserved because the country wanted documentation, wanted education about occupation, wanted young people to understand what happened. The museums opened with that purpose. Schools visit, students learn. The authentic tools displayed as teaching instruments, not hidden. Not destroyed, kept as evidence of what humans can do to other humans. Warsaw's museum opened later, retrofit of government building, the basement already there, the inscriptions already on walls. The decision was whether to preserve or erase. Poland chose preservation, chose to make it uncomfortable, chose dim lighting and screaming sound effects, chose to make visitors feel the horror. That was deliberate. That was a choice about how to remember. Berlin's path was different. Demolition, forgetting, then 1970s rediscovery. Grassroots pressure, survivor organizations, civil rights associations, pointing out significance, fighting plans to build roads through the site, lobbying for preservation, finally winning, getting excavation, getting museum, getting permanent memorial. But by then, 50 plus years after liberation, the physical evidence long gone, what remained was foundations, walls, the footprint of where evil was planned. The question becomes, what is sufficient for remembrance? Do you need the actual torture device to understand torture happened? Do you need the actual chains to grasp that people were chained? Or is testimony enough? Photographs enough? Excavated cells enough? Different countries answered differently. Belgium said, keep the devices. Norway said, keep the devices. Poland said, reconstruct the space. Germany in many places said, excavate the foundations. France in many places said, memorialize the location. Each approach reflects national relationship to the history, how quickly they were ready to confront what they thought future generations needed to see. But across Europe, the pattern is loss. The pattern is destruction. The pattern is that most instruments of Nazi torture no longer exist as physical objects. They exist as descriptions, as measurements, as photographs, as trauma, as memory, as scratches on cell walls made by people who knew they would die and wanted to leave something, anything, a name, a date, a prayer. This is the reality of post-war Europe's handling of Nazi torture implements. Not systematic preservation, not careful cataloging, but urgent survival needs. Demolition, reuse, decades of silence, then gradually, painfully, rediscovery, excavation, museum creation, documentation projects, like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, uncovering, documenting, memorializing thousands of detention sites decades after they closed. The torture devices themselves, though, the archive rods, the chains, the posts, the racks, the implements, most are gone. What remains stands in a handful of museums as testament to preservation choices made 70 plus years ago. Breendonk decided 1947, Bergen decided early, Warsaw decided later, but preserved, Berlin excavated foundations, Athens has a plaque, and thousands of other sites? Nothing. Buildings demolished, land reused, only documentation and testimony remaining. This is what happened to Gestapo torture devices after World War II. Not a single story of preservation or destruction, but thousands of individual stories, thousands of sites, thousands of local decisions, most choosing destruction or neglect, a few choosing preservation. Those few now carry the weight of remembering for all the rest. The Fort Breendonk archive rod bolted to the torture chamber wall represents not just Breendonk. It represents Dachau's missing instruments, Buchenwald's lost implements, Auschwitz's destroyed devices. Every Gestapo headquarters across Europe where the torture happened, but the tools are gone. That one archive rod preserved in Belgium becomes symbol for all the instruments that weren't saved, for all the evidence that was lost, for all the sites that were bulldozed before anyone thought to document what was there. The numbers tell part of the story. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany established over 44,000 camps and detention sites. Each location had methods. Each had instruments. Each had ways of inflicting pain. If even 1% preserved their torture implements, we would have 440 sets. We have maybe a dozen well-documented collections, maybe fewer. Consider what this means mathematically. 44,000 sites. Conservative estimate of 10 torture-capable instruments per site. That's 440,000 potential artifacts. Where are they? Destroyed in Allied bombing, demolished in post-war cleanup, buried in rubble, thrown into rivers, burned, scrapped for metal, stolen by locals, lost, forgotten. Less than 0.003% survival rate. Those are rough numbers, but the scale is right. Near total loss, the mechanisms of loss varied. Some sites, like Gestapo headquarters in major cities, took direct bomb hits. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Munich, Cologne, all had Gestapo offices. All were heavily bombed, buildings reduced to shells. 1945 aerial photographs show devastation. Entire city blocks gone. What survives bombing often doesn't survive demolition. Post-war Germany needed rubble cleared. Needed buildings either repaired or razed. Nazi administrative buildings rarely got repair priority. They got demolition, bulldozers, wrecking balls, dump trucks hauling debris to landfills, British occupation zone, American occupation zone, French occupation zone, Soviet occupation zone. Each handled Nazi buildings differently. The common theme was removal, getting rid of visual reminders, creating clean slate. This meant systematic destruction of infrastructure, including contents. Nobody was saving Gestapo filing cabinets. Nobody was preserving interrogation room furniture. Certainly nobody was cataloging torture devices. The Soviet zone was particularly thorough. They didn't just demolish, they dismantled, shipped anything useful back to USSR. Machinery, farm equipment, fixtures. What wasn't useful was destroyed. Berlin alone lost approximately 80% of government buildings. These included Gestapo facilities. What Soviets didn't take or destroy, they often repurposed, used for their own security apparatus, later used by East German Stasi, which meant modification, removal of Nazi-era elements, installation of Soviet-era systems. Western zones weren't much different. The urgency was clearing destruction, getting cities functional, housing displaced persons, establishing temporary governments. War crimes investigations happened, but were focused on people, on documentation, on testimony, not on preserving crime scenes, not on keeping evidence in place. Investigators took photographs, recorded measurements, interviewed survivors, then moved on. The sites behind them returned to civilian control, or military control, or were demolished. The exception was Nuremberg itself. The Palace of Justice was relatively intact, required renovation for trials, but structure survived. Attached prison held defendants. This became headquarters for prosecution. This had symbolic value. Site of Nazi rallies, now site of Nazi trials. Full circle. But even here, what was preserved was building, courtroom, records, not torture implements from across the Reich. Those weren't centralized, weren't collected. Each site was local. Each site's evidence was local, or disappeared entirely. The doctor trials revealed extent of medical experiments, high-altitude chambers, freezing tanks, experimental surgery equipment. This hardware existed, large installations, purpose-built, but where did it go? Some destroyed before liberation. SS evacuated camps, burned documents, destroyed evidence, including equipment. What remained was captured, photographed, then, unclear, trials used photographs and testimony. The actual pressure chambers, the actual tanks, dismantled, removed, lost. Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. Over 1.1 million people murdered, massive infrastructure, gas chambers, crematoria, punishment blocks, Block 11 in main camp, basement cells, standing cells where prisoners couldn't sit, couldn't lie down. 4 people crammed into space less than 1 square meter. Suffocation cells with no ventilation, starvation cells. These cells survive as structures. You can visit, you can see the space, but the instruments, the chains they used, the specific implements, most gone. What Auschwitz Museum displays today is clothing, shoes, suitcases, personal effects, hair, photographs, documents, the artifacts of victims, not artifacts of perpetrators. The torture implements aren't there, or are minimal. Because when Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz, January 27, 1945, they found 7,000 survivors. They found evidence. They didn't conduct systematic collection of SS tools. They documented, photographed, filmed, moved forward. Same pattern at Mauthausen. At Dachau, at Bergen-Belsen, liberation, documentation, then immediate needs of survivors, then post-war transition, then decades before memorialization, by which time physical objects from Nazi period were largely gone. What could be done was structural preservation, keeping buildings, keeping layouts, reconstructing what was destroyed, using survivor testimony and photographs to understand what was there. The late 20th century rediscovery changed approach. When Berlin excavated Gestapo headquarters site in 1987, archaeology was the method. Careful removal of dumped rubble, finding foundations, mapping layouts, recovering fragments. This was 52 years after building destruction. No intact rooms, no preserved instruments, just traces, archaeological traces. From these traces, plus photographs, plus testimony, they reconstructed history. But it's reconstruction. not preservation of original evidence. This raises an uncomfortable question. If we don't have the actual devices, how do we know what they were? How do we know how they worked? Answer comes from multiple corroborating sources. Survivor testimony is primary. Thousands of testimonies, detailed descriptions, multiple witnesses describing same devices, same methods, same locations. When testimonies align across different survivors who didn't know each other, reliability increases. Second source is perpetrator testimony. War crimes trials compelled testimony. Some defendants describe methods, trying to minimize role, trying to blame others, but providing details, technical details, about procedures, about equipment, about orders. This testimony, while from hostile witnesses, adds information. Cross-referenced with survivor accounts, pattern emerges. Third source is documents, orders for construction of facilities, requisitions for materials, reports detailing interrogation methods, official acknowledgement that torture was policy. These documents survived in various archives, captured by allies, preserved for trials, later released to researchers. They confirm what survivors described. They provide official Nazi language for the horror. Fourth source is liberation photography and film, allies documented thoroughly. U.S. Army Signal Corps, British Army Film Unit, Soviet film teams, they filmed immediately upon liberation, showed conditions, showed survivors demonstrating torture methods, showed execution sites, showed facilities. This film footage, some shown at Nuremberg, preserved visual evidence. Not the devices themselves, but the spaces they occupied. The mechanisms described. Fifth source is physical evidence that does remain. The cells, the walls with scratches, the execution posts at Breendonk, the gallows at Ohrdruf, the foundations at Berlin, the reconstructed torture chamber at Warsaw. Limited, but real. These fragments authenticated by all other sources, showing testimony was accurate. Photographs were accurate, documents were accurate. Together, these sources create robust evidence base, not dependent on physical torture implements, but comprehensive enough to understand what happened, detailed enough to know methods, specific enough to identify locations, strong enough to convict perpetrators. This is why Nuremberg succeeded without needing physical devices. The evidence was overwhelming even without artifacts, but something was lost. Tangibility. When you see actual object, impact differs. Medieval torture museum shows Iron Maiden. You understand immediately. Physical presence communicates in a way description cannot. The weight, the rust, the mechanics visible. Nazi torture implements would have had same impact, but we don't have them. We have photographs of survivors showing scars. We have testimony describing pain. We have reconstructions, but most actual objects are gone. This absence shaped how we remember, how we teach, how we understand. Holocaust education relies heavily on testimony, on documentary evidence, on preserved sites, less on artifacts. Compared to other atrocities, Khmer Rouge's Tuol Sleng prison in Cambodia, preserved with torture implements in place. Rwanda genocide memorials display machetes, tools of killing kept as evidence. Nazi sites, buildings yes, implements no, pattern is different. Why the difference? Timing matters. Tuol Sleng became museum, 1979. Immediately after regime fell, within months. Evidence intact. Decision made to preserve everything. Rwanda genocide happened in 1994. International attention was immediate. Documentation started during events. Preservation prioritized. Nazi Germany fell 1945. International protocols for preservation didn't exist. War crimes, trials were new. Nobody had blueprint for what to save. Also scale. Nazi system operated across continent. 12 years. Millions of victims. Thousands of perpetrators. Hundreds of facilities. Cambodian system was smaller. More concentrated. Easier to preserve representatively. Rwandan genocide happened in weeks. Localized. Evidence collection more feasible. Nazi evidence was spread across Europe. Multiple jurisdictions. Multiple occupying powers. No coordination of preservation efforts. Another factor is Cold War. By time Europe was ready to memorialize, continent was divided. East-West split. Sites on one side inaccessible to other side. Documentation happened in isolation. No comprehensive approach possible. Berlin Wall literally ran through former Gestapo headquarters site. How do you preserve that? You don't. You wait. Wall falls, 1989. Unification happens, 1990. Finally, excavation begins 1987, but proper museum doesn't open until 2010. 65 years after the atrocities. Artifacts were long gone. German post-war psychology also played a role. Collective guilt, collective shame, but also collective desire to move forward. Nobody wanted daily reminders. Nobody wanted torture devices in their town square. Even victims often didn't want preservation. Too painful, too fresh, better to demolish, better to forget. Let survivors tell stories if they could, but physical objects? Too much, too visceral. The sentiment was widespread across Germany, Austria, occupied territories. Result was clearing, removing, starting over. Jewish survivors particularly had mixed feelings. Many wanted evidence preserved, for trials, for history, for preventing denial, but seeing objects of their torture, walking past preserved Gestapo building, that was trauma, daily trauma. So even as they pushed for documentation, they didn't always push for site preservation. Testimony felt more bearable, documents felt more manageable. Physical sites, physical objects, those brought back everything. This created tension between historical necessity and psychological survival, between remembering and healing, between evidence and recovery. Different communities resolved it differently. Belgium chose preservation. Norway chose preservation. Poland chose reconstruction. Germany often chose excavation. France often chose memorialization without preservation. Each reflected local processing of trauma. Economic factors too. Post-war Europe was devastated. Marshall Plan helped, but resources were limited. Preserving Nazi sites meant spending money, maintaining buildings, preventing decay, providing security, creating museums. For what? To remember atrocity? When funds could build housing, schools, hospitals, priority was obvious. Practical needs trumped historical preservation. Most places chose practical. Few chose historical. Exceptions are revealing. Fort Breendonk preservation cost money. Belgium spent it. Why? Because it was intact. Because British had used it after liberation. Because infrastructure was there. Because it could become functional memorial relatively easily. Not building from scratch, not reconstructing. Just maintaining what existed. Cost-benefit made sense. Norwegian sites, similar. Buildings were there. Converting to museums was feasible. Cost was manageable, so it happened. Berlin was opposite. Buildings were destroyed. Site was rubble dump. Preserving meant excavating. Meant building new museum. Meant decades of planning. Meant serious funding. Cost-benefit only made sense once Germany was ready to confront. Once economy was strong. Once political will existed. That took until late 20th century. By then, direct preservation was impossible. Archaeological preservation was all that remained. The Cold War CTA point. If you value documented Cold War and Holocaust history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. This script is researched using sources from the Topography of Terror Foundation Documentation Center archives, particularly their historical site reports from 1978 through 2010, and the War Heritage Institute, Belgium's records on Fort Breendonk preservation dated 1947 to present. Now back to the information. Today's situation reflects all these factors. Fort Breendonk remains Europe's best preserved Nazi torture site. Archive rods still mounted. Execution posts still standing. Torture chamber intact, open to public. Part of Belgian War Heritage Institute. Approximately 50,000 visitors annually. School groups, international tourists, historians. The site serves educational function, confronting function, remembering function. It works because physical evidence exists, because authentic environment was preserved, because you can stand where prisoners stood, see what prisoners saw, Bergen, Norway. Museum similar, Gestapo House of Horror, authentic tools displayed, cell walls with inscriptions, audio testimony playing, interactive screens, suitable for ages 13 up, educational program, guided tours. The authenticity creates impact. The preserved instruments communicate directly. No mediation needed. This is what was used. This is how it worked. This is what happened. Physical evidence speaks. Warsaw's mausoleum took different approach. Reconstruction. The building survived. The basement survived. The scratched inscription survived. So they built around that, added sound effects, added lighting, added replica of SS Chief's office, created immersive experience, uncomfortable experience deliberately. Goal was making visitors feel, making them understand emotionally, not just intellectually. The lack of original instruments didn't prevent this. The space itself carried memory. The inscriptions carried memory. The reconstruction honored that memory. Berlin's Topography of Terror represents third approach, archaeological presentation, excavated foundations visible, information panels explaining what was here, what happened here, photographs showing buildings, documents explaining operations. 200 meters of Berlin Wall providing context, open-air sections, indoor documentation center, comprehensive historical exhibition, but no artifacts, no implements, no devices, just foundations and information. 2 million visitors yearly proves this approach works. Evidence doesn't require objects. Context and documentation can be sufficient. These three models, Breendonk preservation, Warsaw reconstruction, Berlin excavation, represent spectrum of possibility. When original artifacts exist, preserve them. When original space exists, reconstruct within it. When only location exists, excavate and document. Each serves memory. Each educates, each prevents forgetting. None require having every original torture implement, which brings us to the ultimate question. Does absence of most torture devices matter? For historical record, no. We know what happened. We know how it happened. We know who did it. We know who suffered. Documentation is extensive. Testimony is overwhelming. Trials established facts. Subsequent research filled gaps. Deniers deny regardless of evidence quantity. Believers believe because documentation exists. Physical implements wouldn't change fundamental historical understanding. For educational impact, maybe. Some learners need physical objects, need tangibility, need to see actual thing. For them, Breendonk is invaluable. Bergen is invaluable. The preserved sites carry pedagogical weight that reconstructions and excavations cannot match. But most education happens without artifacts, happens through testimony, through film, through photographs, through teaching. Auschwitz educates millions without torture implement collection. Dachau educates without extensive perpetrator artifacts. Documentation center approach works. For emotional impact, complicated. Seeing actual torture device creates visceral response. Seeing preserved cell creates visceral response. But for many, especially survivors and descendants, this is too much, too traumatic, too direct. They prefer mediated experience. Testimony, photographs, documentation, physical distance from objects, both responses are valid. Both needs matter. This suggests multiple types of sites serve different needs. Preserved sites for those who need physical evidence, documentation sites for those who need distance. For justice, irrelevant. Nuremberg trials didn't need physical implements. Subsequent trials didn't need them. Evidence was sufficient. Convictions were secured. Justice was served within limitations of post-war tribunal system. Physical objects would not have increased conviction rates, would not have changed sentences. Testimony and documentary evidence were legally sufficient. Physically compelling, but not legally necessary. For memory, essential question. Do we remember better with artifacts? Unclear. Warsaw Ghetto was destroyed. No buildings remain. Yet memory is powerful. Transmitted through generations. Written, filmed, taught. Physical absence didn't prevent memory transmission. Auschwitz stands. Buildings preserved. Yet denial persists. Physical presence didn't prevent denial. Memory seems independent of physical evidence. Dependent instead on cultural commitment to remembering, on education, on testimony preservation, on refusing to forget. This suggests that most Gestapo torture devices being lost was tragic but not catastrophic. Tragic because physical evidence has unique value. Because artifacts carry authenticity. Because direct encounters with objects of atrocity create understanding that mediated encounters cannot. Losing most implements means losing most opportunities for that direct encounter. That's real loss. That matters. But not catastrophic, because memory doesn't require artifacts. Memory requires commitment, requires education, requires transmission, requires refusing silence, the extensive documentation, the preserved testimony, the excavated sites, the few preserved implements. Together, these constitute sufficient foundation for memory. Not ideal, not complete, but sufficient. The pattern of loss across Europe tells us something about post-war priorities, about trauma response, about practical necessity versus historical preservation, about how societies choose to remember or forget. Most sites demolished reflects choice for moving forward, for practical rebuilding, for psychological healing, for economic recovery. Few sites preserved reflects counter-choice, for confronting, for documenting, for preventing repetition, for honoring victims through remembering rather than forgetting. Neither choice was wrong. Both were human responses to inhuman situation. Survivors who said demolish were protecting themselves. Survivors who said preserve were protecting history, both protecting something valuable, both responding to trauma in valid way. Result is mosaic. Some preserved, much lost, pattern rather than system, local rather than coordinated, human rather than planned. What we have today is consequence of those choices. Fort Breendonk, because Belgium chose preservation in 1947. Bergen museums because Norway chose preservation early. The Warsaw Museum because Poland chose reconstruction later. Berlin's Topography of Terror because grassroots activists chose excavation, 1980s. Thousands of demolished sites because most chose moving forward. This mosaic is our inheritance, working with what survived rather than mourning what didn't, using available evidence rather than wishing for unavailable artifacts. The scholarship adapted. Holocaust studies doesn't depend on torture implement collections, depends on testimony archives, on documentary evidence, on archaeological site analysis, on demographic reconstruction, on financial records, on transportation logs, on camp administration documents, on perpetrator interrogations, on survivor interviews, on liberation photographs and films, on post-war investigations. Massive evidential base exists. Physical torture implements are a tiny fraction. Their absence didn't prevent comprehensive historical understanding. Education adapted. Museum exhibitions use photographs, video testimony, interactive displays, reconstructions, virtual reality, augmented reality, every tool except extensive original artifact collections, because artifacts mostly don't exist, so pedagogy developed without them, proved effective without them. Millions learn annually, understand systematically, comprehend deeply, all without seeing actual Gestapo torture devices. Proof that memory transmission doesn't require artifacts, requires commitment and creativity instead. Commemoration adapted. Memorials mark sites where artifacts no longer exist. Stumbling stones embed in sidewalks. Name lists inscribe on walls. Eternal flames burn. Moments of silence observe. None require physical torture implements. All transmit memory. All honor victims. All commit to never again. All work despite absence of artifacts. Because memory is practice, not possession. Remembering is action, not object. Commemoration happens through ritual, not relics. The few preserved torture implements that do exist carry disproportionate weight. Breendonk's archive rod represents all archive rods across all Gestapo facilities. Bergen's authentic tools represent all authentic tools across all Norwegian sites. Warsaw's reconstructed chamber represents all chambers across all Polish sites. These few artifacts become symbols, metonyms. Standing in for missing whole, carrying memory for lost objects, representing the unpreserved. This symbolic function is crucial, makes the few survivors of destruction represent the thousands that didn't survive. Archaeological digs continue. Berlin excavation happened in 1980s. Other sites excavated since, ongoing work at various locations, finding foundations, mapping structures, recovering fragments, small artifacts, buttons, utensils, building materials. Each fragment adds to knowledge, adds to physical evidence base, but torture implements? Rarely found. Either destroyed deliberately, or didn't survive decades of burial, or were taken as souvenirs, or were scrap metal, or were ordinary objects that don't look like torture devices. This last point is crucial. Gestapo tortured with ordinary objects. Batons, chains, rods, buckets. Wooden horses. Archive rod was just rod. Strappado needed just rope and pulley. Standing cells were just small rooms. Water torture needed just water. Beating needed just fists or sticks. Most torture required minimal specialized equipment. Used common items. This means even if objects survive, they don't look like torture devices. They look like rods, like chains, like rooms. Context made them instruments of torture. Without context, they're just objects. Found artifacts often can't be definitively identified as torture implements. Is this rod the rod? Is this chain the chain? Maybe, maybe not. Authentication requires provenance, requires documentation, requires witness testimony linking object to location to event. Often, this doesn't exist. Object sits in storage, could be torture device, could be hardware. Uncertainty prevents display, prevents education, prevents commemoration. Better to display documented artifact, even if reconstructed, than undocumented artifact, even if authentic. Survivor testimony archives, our most reliable source. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum holds extensive collections. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem holds extensive collections. Many national archives hold testimony, thousands of recorded interviews, video testimony, written testimony, detailed accounts of torture, descriptions of devices, descriptions of methods, descriptions of pain. This testimony is primary evidence, more reliable than physical objects would be, because testimony includes context, includes experience, includes meaning. Objects without testimony are mute. Testimony without objects still speaks. Recent technology enables new preservation, three-dimensional scanning of surviving sites, virtual reality reconstructions, digital archives, online testimony collections. These don't replace physical artifacts, but they extend access. Let people worldwide visit preserved sites virtually. Experience spaces even if demolished. Hear testimony even if survivors have died. Technology democratizes memory, makes preservation choices from 1940s accessible in 2025, compensates somewhat for loss of physical objects. The question of what happened to Gestapo torture devices after World War II has complex answer. Most were destroyed. Some were lost. Few were preserved. A tiny number exist in museums today. The destruction resulted from bombing, demolition, neglect, theft, and deliberate disposal. The loss resulted from lack of preservation protocols, competing priorities, psychological trauma, economic constraints, and political division. The preservation resulted from early decision-making by few locations, survivor advocacy, grassroots activism, and eventual national commitment to confronting history. What this means practically is most Nazi torture sites exist only as documentation, photographs, testimony, films, written records, archaeological remains. Memory, not physical objects. This absence shapes how we remember, makes remembering more abstract, more mediated, more dependent on testimony than artifacts. This isn't necessarily bad, just different from remembering when objects survive. It requires more imagination, more trust in testimony, more reliance on documentation, more commitment to maintaining non-physical evidence. It also means the few sites with preserved implements are precious, disproportionately valuable, should be protected, maintained, kept accessible, because they carry memory load for thousands of lost sites. They're not just themselves. They're representatives, they're examples, they're proof. When deniers say it didn't happen, Breendonk exists. When skeptics question methods, Bergen displays devices. When educators need concrete evidence, Warsaw provides space. These few preserved sites authenticate all the destroyed sites, prove testimony was accurate, validate survivor accounts, confirm historical record. The late excavation at Berlin Gestapo headquarters revealed something unexpected. When archaeologists dug through decades of rubble and fill, they found the basement cells. The walls stood, the layout was intact, and scratched into the walls were marks. Prisoners had carved names, dates, messages, same as in Bergen, same as in Warsaw. These scratches survived decades of neglect, survived demolition debris piled on top, survived being forgotten, survived Cold War division. The excavation in 1987 brought them to light. Those scratches are physical evidence, not torture devices, but evidence of torture's victims, evidence of people who knew they would die, who used last strength to leave mark. To say I was here, I existed, I suffered. These marks, found in rubble 52 years after building was destroyed, proved that even without torture devices, physical evidence survives. Different evidence, not implements, but impacts, not devices, but traces. Not tools, but testimonies carved in stone. This is what survived most commonly. The marks victims made, the scratches, the inscriptions, the drawings. These are found repeatedly at preserved sites, at excavated sites, wherever walls survived. Victims left evidence, left names, left memories, left warnings. This evidence, made by victims not perpetrators, tells truth more powerfully than any torture device could. Torture device shows what was done. Victim's scratch shows who suffered. Both are evidence, but scratches carry humanity, carry names, carry resistance, carry refusal to be forgotten. Fort Breendonk opened its memorial in 1947. 78 years ago, as of this recording. In those 78 years, approximately 3 million people have visited. 3 million people have seen the authentic torture chamber, have seen the archive rod, have seen where prisoners suffered, have read the scratched names on cell walls, have stood at execution posts, have confronted physical evidence of what humans did to humans. That's 3 million educated, 3 million confronted, 3 million remembering, because one fortress was preserved. If every Nazi site had been preserved, impact would be overwhelming, also impossible, also perhaps counterproductive. Too many sites, too much trauma, too expensive, too complicated. The preserved few serve representative function, enough to authenticate, enough to educate, enough to remember. Not everything survived, but enough survived. That's the answer. Not most, not all, but enough.